Well, good evening, everybody. My name is James Jensen, and I'm the Executive Director of the Osgood Township Museum. This is the first museum talk I've been able to be part of. In addition to myself and our speaker, we're also joined by Caitlin McDougall, the museum's education officer, who organized tonight's talk. The Osgood Township Museum acknowledges that our museum, located in Vernon, Ontario, just south of Ottawa, is on the traditional, unceded ancestral land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Algonquin Anishinaabe are the original inhabitants of this territory along the Ottawa, Rideau, and Castor rivers, and have lived on this land since time immemorial. We are grateful to have the opportunity to be present in this territory. The Osgood Township Museum is located in the community of Vernon, Ontario, in the southernmost part of Ottawa, and has been operating as a museum since 1973. The OTM tells the story of Ottawa's agricultural and rural heritage in the former Osgood Township. If you visit the museum during the spring, summer, or fall, you'll get the chance to wander around the grounds, visit the 10,000 square foot heritage garden that is modeled after a 1907 school garden. The main museum building houses an eclectic collection of approximately 10,000 artifacts. The artifacts in the collection range from 3D objects like everyday household items such as a potato masher to full-size tractors and threshing mills. We'll now hand it over to Caitlin to address a couple of logistical things.
So thank you everyone for taking the time to join us today. This talk is scheduled to be an hour long, which includes a short time set aside at the end for you to ask questions. You may type your questions in the chat throughout the presentation, and we will read them to our speaker to answer at the end. The talk is being recorded and will be uploaded to the museum's YouTube page for access later.
All right, thanks, Caitlin. So tonight we are joined by Rachel Everett-Fry. Rachel is a writer and cultural anthropologist from North Grenville. Currently a doctoral researcher with the University of Cambridge, Rachel has also worked as a journalist and as a farm worker. As a member of the LGBTQ2+ community and a settler on unceded Anishinaabe territory, Rachel has a personal commitment to intersectional social justice. And it's my pleasure to hand things over to Rachel.
Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. Do you guys see this? Yes? No, you don't see my screen?
Hang on a moment. How's that?
Yes, okay. You've got it?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I would like to thank the Osgood Township Museum for hosting, all of you for tuning in, and the North Grenville Public Library for letting me use their slightly better than my rural Wi-Fi. I would also like to thank all of the people who have shared their stories with me in the making of this presentation. I would also like to acknowledge again that I'm speaking from the unceded Algonquin territory, and the very frameworks that I'm using to speak, such as those of province, urban and rural divisions, and gender, are imported colonial categories. Today, I'm going to use qualitative methods to talk about LGBTQ+ farmers in Ontario. This means that my information is based on methods such as archival research, interviews, life histories, and personal experience. These are the stories of real people. I'm going to begin with a brief definition of terms. Then I will shift to a preliminary history of LGBTQ+ activism in Canada. And then I will introduce you to 8 living individuals or couples who each in their own way navigate or have navigated farming, food production, and the tensions between rural and urban life. So this is likely to be review information, but in case not, the LGBTQ2+ acronym refers to the following. Lesbian, typically used by women who exclusively or prefer to romantically or sexually involve themselves with women. Gay is often associated as the inverse, but for men, but it is in fact used by all genders to refer to same gender preferences. Bisexual is a category used by people who are romantically or sexually interested in 2 or more genders. Trans is an umbrella term that refers to folks who identify with a gender identity other than that which they were assigned to at birth. So people who identify with the category they were assigned at birth are referred to as cisgender. There is an array of gender experience and expression beyond cisgender, which includes folks who transition medically and or socially from the gender they were assigned at birth to the opposite gender, those who identify as non-binary, so not strongly identifying as either man or as a woman, gender fluid, so at times identifying more or less with either category, and more. The Q stands for queer, which is used interchangeably as a blanket category for those who are not heterosexual and or not cisgendered, or to refer to the flexibility and fluidity of one's identity. Queer has been reclaimed from a slur, so for some folks, it remains a sensitive term. The 2 stands for Two-Spirit, which is a pan-Indigenous category, another blanket term to refer to a person that embodies both male and female spirits, or a 3rd gender category altogether. Rigid rules of gender and sexuality are largely a Western construct that have been spread through acts of colonization and structures of settler colonialism. The plus symbol refers to the multiple other queer identities that overlap or coexist with the ones I've listed above. This includes things like pansexuality, asexuality, and so on. There is also a recognition in the LGBTQ2+ community that queerness intersects with multiple other identities of race, class, ability, ethnicity, religion, and so on. This is reflected in the progress flag that I'm showing on this slide. No dimension of a person's identity can be considered in isolation. And furthermore, systems of oppression are linked. So the origins of the gay rights movement are typically traced back to the Stonewall riots of New York City in June of 1969. This was a moment of uprising against homophobia and violence faced by the queer community, brought to a head by targeted police raids and arrests in LGBTQ spaces. The first gay rights march in Canada, which is pictured here, came soon after in 1971. A group of about 100 people participated, largely activists coming from Montreal and Toronto, who came to Ottawa with a list of 10 demands for equal rights and protection under law. Though Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau had decriminalized homosexual acts in 1969, the 10 demands included very basic things like right to equal employment and protection for homosexuals under the law. So even in this very brief history, it is apparent that the epicenter of LGBTQ+ activism, community, and indeed life at large takes place in and between major cities. This partly is a historical fact. Queer people have gained their power to lobby for rights and indeed the numbers to form communities in cities, while sparse rural populations lead to less opportunity to explore one's own identity, to find friends and partners, and to collectively share experiences of marginalization that then come together to produce collective political action. These are the kinds of push and pull factors that are talked about in studies of migration. Many LGBTQ2+ people were, and continue to be, pushed from rural communities and pulled into urban areas. And while all of this is true, it's also a story. The history of Pride that I've told locates gay activism in the late 60s and early 70s, and exclusively in urban areas. Such stories, repeated through time, narrows our vision of what queer people do and have done and where they live. In the Toronto archives, the LGBTQ2+ archives of Canada, another story is visible. This is the story of Jim Egan and Jack Nesbitt. Jim Egan is largely considered to be Canada's first gay activist. He came of age in the Great Depression, and largely through a love of books, he came to realize himself as a gay man. In the 1940s, he joined the Navy, which he described as a gay underworld. and after this, he moved to Toronto, attracted by the already established gay community there. There, he met Jack Nesbitt, who would eventually become his husband. Though society was overtly homophobic, viewing homosexuality as a perversion and a public threat, Jim penned articles from the gay point of view for the Globe and Mail and the New York Times as early as the 1950s. Jim and Jack, however, wanted more than city life. They wanted home ownership, domesticity, and a relationship to the land. They bought a farm near Chelsea, Ontario. Jim's public activism made the couple all too visible in this small community, and particularly Jack became troubled and uncomfortable with this outspoken role. The couple would ultimately split up for over a decade over this problem. While Jim wanted to be loud, outspoken, and challenge injustice, Jack wanted to quietly live his life without fear or ridicule. The couple ultimately found their way back to one another, and in the 1980s, their partnership became highly visible once more when Jim and Jack applied for spousal allowance benefits, for which they met all criteria, but they were simply a same-sex couple. This resulted in the Supreme Court of Canada case of 1995, which they lost. But it was simultaneously ruled that sexual orientation needed to be protected from discrimination under the law. This set the stage for many future legal victories for the queer community, including the right to marry. The couple remained together until Jim's death in 2000, and Jack died 3 months later. This is to say, the history that we hear time and again, even the history deemed interesting enough to record in the first place, favors certain kinds of events and indeed people. Much of recorded queer history is very white and very male, largely because it was other white males who took interest, even if negative interest, in such topics. Further, and the point I want to elaborate here, is about visibility. Non-straight and non-cis people have always existed, to greater or lesser knowledge of their surrounding communities. It has, however, not always been desirable to be visible. Jim made headlines for his activism, while Jack wanted to enjoy his life without public scrutiny. Both of these are legitimate courses of action, but when tracing queer people through time, those who, understandably, remained invisible are omitted from the historical record. So one of the things that I've been working on is to record some stories of queer folk who are or who have farmed in Canada, and particularly Ontario. And that is what we will turn our attention to now. Douglas was born in 1948 in Cookstown, south of Barrie. His parents were farmers, and he says that he had a wonderful childhood. He dabbled in university, but eventually he dropped out to travel with his then partner, Debbie. In the 60s, he and Debbie heard about a back to the land movement that was happening in Lanark County. He said the motto of the time was tune in, turn on, drop out. Douglas and Debbie did drop out. They got a log cabin with no water, no electricity, no anything. They had a huge garden from which they grew all their own food and a large community around them. Included in this back to the land community were a few families and several American draft dodgers. Douglas characterized the whole movement as very heterosexual. There was only one openly gay couple, Ken and Evergon, the noted Canadian artist. He explained, "You're out there, it's cute and it's wonderful, you're back on the land, but then you're out of money. You can't live without money." So he and Debbie both had to work desk jobs in town, all the while, quote, doing this constant thing with wood. You're cutting it, you're splitting it, you're stacking it again, you're burning it, and then you have to keep burning it or you'll freeze, and then you're carrying it and stacking it and chopping it. Through this period, Douglas became more emboldened to come out. While in the 60s, he says people weren't out, by the 70s, the gay rights movement had gained some steam. Douglas said he had known he was gay since the 7th grade, but thought that he must be the only one. Once he came out, he and Debbie split up, and Douglas moved to Ottawa to participate in the gay scene there. He never went back to rural living or food producing ever again. He says this is not about a lack of queer community, but how hard it was to live off of the land. But he doesn't regret his time spent doing so because he learned to take care of himself. Nonetheless, Douglas still has an interest in self-sufficiency. He does some flower gardening and is interested in implementing off-grid designs in urban homes. He says, quote, "Most gay people I know have some interest in self-sufficiency and in being hands-on. I think when we were young, we never felt like we belonged. There was nothing out there that reaffirmed what you were. You're not part of society's world or your parents' world. Even if you understand that you're gay, you're like an alien creature visiting here. So the decisions you made and things you did were determined by the fact that you're an alien. You have no support system. You internalize that you're the only one, and so you have to deal with being out there on your own." Elizabeth was born to a military family in 1954. She grew up moving between the Maritimes, Ottawa, and Victoria. While attending university for social work in BC in the early 80s and participating in the thriving women's rights community there, she realized that she was not straight. She now uses the identities of lesbian, gay, or queer interchangeably. She met her partner Maureen working at the Northwest Community College in 1981. And the couple began rural life together 25 miles outside of Terrace, BC, in a village with the population size of 25. The couple made a commitment to themselves and to one another to never live their lives in the closet. They were actively involved in women's rights groups, LGBT activism, and Indigenous rights politics. They started a weekly open phone line called the Gay Connection Party Line and ran a newsletter called Open Door. The couple soon realized they wanted more acreage in order to raise livestock, so they bought a property of over 100 acres along the Skeena River. They built their own house, cut their own road, hand pumped their water, tended their livestock, cut hay, and sold veggies at the local farmers market. When she explained it to me, Elizabeth made it sound easy, but she recalls the first night that she and Maureen spent at their new farm, listening to the coyotes scream at their doorstep throughout the sleepless night, wondering to themselves, what have we done? They named the farm the Crow's Nest and spent 10 years farming there. Maureen worked there full time while Elizabeth kept her job at the college. Elizabeth remembers how isolating the winters were, but also terribly beautiful, gazing out across fields of snow and seeing glaciers in the distance. But the couple realized their mortality. Their work with livestock was dangerous, and they were hours from the nearest hospital. In 2002, they picked up their lives and moved to Ontario. They considered giving up farming altogether and visited Ottawa with the idea of taking up city living, but it wasn't for them. They started up a certified organic vegetable farm in Perth, which they happily maintained until their retirement in 2018. When I asked Elizabeth what was so compelling about farming for her, she said that it's a way of life that fulfills so many basic needs. There's learning, community building, admin, management, husbandry, awareness of the environment, and looking at the sky. Elizabeth has been very active in creating an LGBTQ2+ community in Perth. She created Queer Connection Lanark, an informal group that organizes and links LGBT services and events. She says that rural communities get a bad rap, but I really don't think it's so bad. For her, it's all about visibility. By being visible, the straight community can't live in a fantasy where they don't know any queer people, because most straight people do know queer people. They just may not know it. She says, I like to beat people to the goalpost. If I say or show that I'm gay, they get to work it over. People really aren't likely to say anything about it. You can't institutionalize fear, and you have to give people a chance. Celeste lives and runs her business in Grey County, Ontario. She grew up in the outskirts of Toronto and then went to the University of Guelph for environmental studies. There, she studied food systems, spent her summers working on organic farms, and got involved working with not-for-profits about food sovereignty. She and her partner both realized that they wanted to live more rurally, and about 2 years ago, they purchased their land and established a farm-to-table meal delivery service. The idea came to her as a way to balance her desire to farm with the dire economic barriers to establishing a successful farm. The Conscious Farm Kitchen delivers meals in 3 regions, and they have 1 full-time employee. Personally, Celeste really values the privacy afforded in rural life. She explains that she and her partner are both introverts who value quiet times by themselves. She also explains that she loves the lifestyle because her pets really enjoy it. They have dogs and pigs, and she says, quote, "Watching them do their thing outside and being really happy is so fulfilling to me." Celeste was surprised, upon moving rurally, to not encounter more open homophobia. She does, however, note that subtle assumptions, like being asked, "Where's your husband?" is quite commonplace. But she says, people here are not necessarily educated about sexuality, and their environment is so straight, you can't even blame them. There aren't a lot of queer people or even people of color who live in these areas. So I think some people avoid those who they see as different. But it goes the other way too. A lot of queer people write off country living completely because they don't see a community for them. For Celeste, this issue is deeply political. She says small towns are dying. She points out that so many small towns lack in population size and have an aging population. As such, opportunities for employment dwindle. She says there's not a lot of resources here, but if more young people move up here, community will come. I know a lot of queer people who really want to live rurally, but can't for XYZ. We need to create better opportunities for these people to get here. Celeste's love for farming, rural living, and cooking are not rooted in a desire for self-sufficiency. She says, we don't identify with the back to the land or do-it-yourself kind of thing. Our intentions were never to become self-sufficient, like growing everything we eat or doing our own woodworking. We don't have the skill set for that, and that's okay. We just want to live in a peaceful environment and be connected to nature. We can't suddenly do everything for ourselves just because we live in the country. We rely on other farmers and on other professional work. No one can do everything, but everyone can be fulfilled and have a place. Cole lives in the Williamsburg area with his wife. Cole grew up in the urban Niagara region, but always felt drawn to country living. He has a PhD in sociology and a professional career. In 2020, Cole and his wife bought a 1-acre lot to start the transition towards self-sufficiency and homesteading. For Cole, the homesteading is a start. He hopes to build the size and scope of the farm to operate as a source of income. He loves the tranquility and feelings of self-sufficiency that come with growing one's own food and the relationship to his animals that rural life affords. He currently has chickens, turkeys, quail, and bunnies, but hopes to get into more species of animals as he scales up the farm. He says, quote, "When you watch the chickens peck in the grass, they truly live in the moment. It's simple. It brings you into the present. It reminds you to be mindful. And they are funny to watch. It's just one of those simple joys of life." But as much as Cole loves rural life, he says he straddles 2 worlds. I have my city friends where everyone is super leftist and educated. And then out here, I don't think there's anyone with the same background as me, but they are out here growing veggies and raising animals like I do. So I don't fully fit in either place. There is nobody who has a similar experience as me. When I spoke to Cole, we were still in the midst of our provincial election campaign, and he explained that while he expected conservative views moving out in the country, he underestimated how deeply held those views might be. He says, quote, "Maybe we align in some ways, like valuing the rural lifestyle, but on the social level, we don't align at all. It's scary not to see yourself reflected or even considered. I look at a neighbor's lawn and there's a sign or a flag that opposes my whole identity." When Cole first moved to the country, he was presenting as a lesbian woman. At that time, men didn't really seem to take him seriously and offered unsolicited advice to help what they viewed as a helpless woman. So Cole made friends with a community of women who raised chickens. But as Cole came to terms with his gender identity as a trans man and began his transition, this group of friends dropped him. This rejection led to Cole taking a step back from local social life and really questioning if he fits in this community at all. But his small farm offers him a stable sense of community. He says, "The lifestyle on my property, here with my animals, gives me purpose. You're contributing to the greater good. You come as you are. I offer unconditional acceptance and belonging no matter what, and I get that in return." For Cole, there is hope in changing the demographics of rural areas. Though the cost of land, the aging population, and staunch conservatism are indeed barriers, he says that more and more young people are becoming interested in sustainability and the kind of life they might lead outside the city. He says, "I hope that one day there will be more visibility in terms of pride anything here. It's probably a long way off. It's my dream that there will be a group of LGBTQ2+ homesteaders who will just get together and talk." I don't know how much of that you got, but the point that I will make is that I really love agriculture and I really love rural life. And it has been through my education and the opportunities that I've been given in my life that I've found the confidence to be a visible and open queer person. And I think that it's politically important to do that so that young people or people who are unsure about their sexuality don't have to struggle in the ways that I did. A person's identity and their passions should not have to be at odds. This is Katie and Jeanette. They are the couple behind Tipsy Willow Farm in Indian River, Ontario. They raise upward of 300 sheep, a few pigs, water buffalo, ducks, and laying hens. They do some produce and also make bath and body products with the byproducts of their meat processing so as not to waste any part of the animal. Jeanette was born and raised a farmer. She works alongside her mother, Geraldine, to use regenerative and traditional agricultural methods to foster a sustainable food system for their community, their land, and their animals. Geraldine immigrated to Canada from Scotland 35 years ago, where she too is raising and running sheep using traditional pastoral methods. Jeanette is also a firefighter, tree planter, and sheep shearer. Katie grew up in Belleville and only realized she might want to farm during her time in university studying environmental studies and geography. She then Googled organic farms in her area, looking for a summer job to try out farming. She stumbled upon a small farm run by lesbians. Katie says, "I went into farming not a farmer, and I thought that I was straight, and then I came out very gay and a farmer." But soon, Katie realized her dream of farming may not be attainable. She could not find any affordable land. But one day, the couple's stars aligned and they matched on Tinder. Not long after their first date, Katie moved in at Jeanette's farm and they began farming together. Katie also works full-time off the farm. They explain that being young, gay woman farmers really gets people talking, and it's helped them in getting people interested in their farm, their products, and the regenerative agriculture methods that they employ. At first, people in their community didn't realize that they were a couple. They assumed that Katie was just a friend living at Jeanette's to help out. They still deal with assumptions that they are friends or coworkers. But Jeanette says that people always ask if it's hard being young gay women in a rural community. And at first it was a bit so-so, but then people just don't care. People want it to be more of a big factor for us than it is. In fact, the couple say they experience more direct discrimination for being young female farmers than for their sexuality directly. People assume that they lack skills, are unable to handle large livestock or machinery, or must be relying on a man somewhere along the line. Of course, none of that is the case. Micheline Simone identifies as a queer hoser. She lives in Toronto, working for Aveling, an integrated brewery farm kitchen in the city. She also farms rurally in Creemore in Simcoe County. After growing up in small town Ontario, Micheline's interest in farming is rooted in her passion for food sovereignty. After studying conflict studies and gender studies in university, she came to realize how food is a human right and food justice is social justice. She uses agroecology principles in her farming. Her current urban farm is located on a rooftop in downtown Toronto. For Micheline, farming is about creating an ecosystem. The rooftop that was once sterile has become a place to which pollinators and birds return year after year. The soil has been built up with enough organic matter for worms to thrive. Micheline also feels her work deeply. She knows if she stopped farming for a season, she would miss it, its rhythms and its physicality. She even dreams about her plants. Seeing them start to fruit or rot in her dreams has coincidentally become reality on a few occasions. Micheline identifies as bisexual, and like many bisexual people, struggles with the invisibility that comes when dating the opposite gender. She explains that because of dominant societal norms, dating men is easier. But now, in a long-term relationship with a woman, Micheline has started to hear comments about what people think about her back in her small hometown. People ask those close to her questions like, is she a lesbian now? This is disconcerting for Micheline. She explains that in the city, the whole sexuality topic is a non-issue. There's acceptance without question. No one turns their heads. At this point in our conversation, I asked Micheline if she would want to live rurally, if it could be guaranteed to her that she would not face any homophobia. She said yes, with no pause. This demonstrates the state of play quite nicely. I would certainly want Micheline as a neighbor. Not only is she funny and bright and engaged, but her work contributes to local ecology and economy alike. And while Micheline explains that she knows many people in rural areas would support her choices, she's weary of the amount of energy she would be asked to put into conversations about her sexuality. Micheline highlights how important it is to see people for more than just their sexuality. Even if they are out loud and proud, they are also a complete person with many other dimensions of their personality. She says, quote, "What someone might refer to as a lesbian down the road is so much more than a lesbian. In fact, that might be the least interesting thing about them." Micheline's hope for the future are that she can make a living off of farming that doesn't break her body or her spirit. Right now, she works 2 jobs, about 60 hours a week, to survive without being in poverty. She also hopes to be able to afford land, which without generational wealth is out of reach for so many farmers. She would like to see farming reframed as a public service, its labor compensated as well as other public services are. In our current system, she says that individuals take the brunt of failures or shortfalls. But in a resilient system, as with a resilient ecosystem, there is a collectivity, a community, with fail-safes and supports built in. To truly build such a resilient community requires healthy and diverse ecosystems and a rethinking of dominant social structures such as capitalism and colonialism. Rav is an urban farmer who runs Shade of Meaty, a food and climate justice organization. Shade of Meaty translates to shade of soil, Meaty being the word for soil in Punjabi. Rav, a first-generation settler in Mississauga, wanted to pay respect to her family's long history of farming in the Punjab state of India. Meaty, then, is an acknowledgement of this history, and also, quote, "a daily reminder that soil plays such an important role in our lives, and that as a farmer and a business owner, one of the central things I need to think about is soil as land." Rav went to university for environmental science and came to realize her passion for teaching. In her last year of university, she was looking for a job that wasn't a desk job, and she got her first taste of farming. At the time, she said she wasn't aware of her family's history with agriculture and remembers the experience as the first time she touched soil and the first time she planted a seed. She loved it and then started working toward a goal of food and climate education. She found that she could do the most meaningful work outside of larger organizations, in which concerns for the interests of various stakeholders or bureaucratic rules limited her ability to respond quickly and effectively to community needs, or to do so from an intersectional standpoint. She looked for farmland inside of Mississauga and unable to find affordable land inside the city, Rav's farm now operates on rented land outside of Caledon. Her farm and the surrounding areas is currently under threat due to the construction of Highway 413. The provincial Conservatives were the only party to support this development, in spite of expert advice to not proceed with the construction. Rav recognizes that Ontario is in real need of affordable and available housing and improved transportation infrastructure. However, she finds it troubling that the government is undertaking these challenges with the same logics it has always used: urban sprawl. She says, there's ways of developing we haven't even considered. We have the opportunity to rethink fundamentally what we are doing. During COVID, everyone said we had to build back better, but here we are building back the same. But as someone who does not own land and within an elected majority government, Rav recognizes that there's very little she can do. The highway will be built and the sprawl will happen. Rav says she will be focusing her energies on the community level, trying to ensure that community initiatives are at least implemented, like making housing affordable or pushing for multi-use vertical growth. Rav has only recently begun to state that she identifies as bisexual, and she explains that she has chosen to do so because not a lot of people seem to disclose their sexuality in the farming world. So she wants to open a door for others to reflect or realize their own sexuality. She explains also that each part of her identity is what she brings to farming. She says, I'm queer, I'm a first-generation immigrant, a woman of color, a farmer. I bring all of that to my business. I'm still working on what that means. All of these factors change how you interact with food, from how you might access services like a food bank or how you navigate policy. She also explains that in the process of thinking through identity and her farming practice, she has started to notice the patterns in nature that she wasn't picking up on before. Seeing how plants grow and different animals on the farm interact with one another reminds her of how we don't need to limit ourselves in terms of who we are, how we identify, or what we want our life to look like. For humans, it is so easy to fall back on convention for ease of understanding, but the non-human world isn't like that. By now, as I come toward the end of this presentation, it should be clear that there is a wide array of experience and opinion within and between the farmers and growers that have shared their stories for us today. There are certainly some common themes, such as a university education providing the basis from which one discovers what matters, that farming provides moments of simple, grounded joy, or the economic precarity involved in farming and land ownership. We also have points of contradiction. Douglas, who says queer people typically desire self-sufficiency, and Celeste, who has more of a it takes a village attitude. But I suppose this is precisely the point. There is as much diversity within the LGBTQ2+ community as there is outside of it. There is no queer point of view, but an array of views and experiences, all of which are necessary and all of which are important. I would like to close by offering an analogy. It is inspired by something Rav said to me, which was, quote, "There's so much beauty in nature as it wants to grow, but we have this weird desire to control every little thing. We don't let things grow how they want to. We force them to grow under our system," end quote. So I want to say that we've been monocropping here in Canada, literally and metaphorically, since the time of colonization. Monocropping, the practice by which biodiversity is replaced by pure stands of only one crop for cultivation, isn't natural by any definition of the term. Sure, it feeds people, is economically productive and efficient, but we are increasingly realizing that monocropping does a lot of harm. It can lead to extinction, leaves crops susceptible to disease, requires intensive water use and intensive use of fertilizer, or the soil becomes dry and depleted. The same kind of thing has and is happening in rural communities. So many of the stories I have shared with you today include comments about how rural towns are dying, their populations aging, the opportunities being squeezed out of them. Many young people abandon rural life and family farms, taking with them all the rich diversity and nutrients they might bring into their town, like a depleted soil in which water can't sink in to nourish the plants, but just runs off the surface. The solution? Permaculture, food forests, or regenerative agriculture. Each recognize diversity as a strength. This is the kind of resilient system that Micheline talked about. Each member of the community serves a purpose in their own time, so that where or when others need support, it's available. Queerness provides an opportunity to think through this deeply. When you come up against oppression, you become more open to realizing other places oppression exists as well. And you push to think differently, to refuse to take for granted the established ways of thinking or doing things. I think it's time now that all of us think seriously about doing this. Thank you all for your time and attention and for bearing with me in my internet hiccup. If you would like to get in touch with me about comments, critical concerns, or to chat about your own experiences, please feel free to drop me an email. I would love to hear from you. Thanks.
Okay, so if anyone has any questions for Rachel, we do have some time left. You can type those in the chat or feel free to unmute yourself. We'd be happy to take questions. Just while we're waiting here, I want to thank you so much, Rachel, on behalf of the Osgood Township Museum. Your presentation was wonderful and thought-provoking, and we really appreciate the time that you took to put it together for us. I'm sure everyone here probably feels the same way.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Got a comment here. Great idea for an event. Oh, there's a question here. I'm curious if any of these farms take woofers or apprentices, or they're not operating at that capacity.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I can't say that I would actually know, but I do think that most small farmers work at a breakneck speed, especially during the summers. So taking the time to have an apprentice is often not worth it. But that being said, I think that if you establish a relationship with someone, there's probably room for these things. I just can't necessarily speak to what each individual has as their framework for that.
That's a great question. While we're waiting here, I sort of have a question. So I know that you're doing your research, and I was just wondering how you go about getting in touch with all of the people that you talked about today.
Thank you. That's a great question. It's something I also think about a lot because it's pretty hard. My two main resources have been Instagram, and that has a pretty young demographic. Most of the people I talked about in the latter half I found through Instagram. And then the older farming generations, I just kind of use networks that I know. My godfather is Charlie Hill, who was actually pictured in one of my slides from the first Gay Pride event. So he's very well connected and was able to put me in touch with a few of the older folks that I've been talking about.
Thank you. We just have a comment here, www.fancyfarmerettes.ca. Veronica and I were born and raised in TO, but 4 years ago, we both said, screw it, and let's go rural. I turned 50 in September. Veronica turned 43 in April. Not spring chicks, but very out in rural Norfolk County. We've been together over a decade. Check us out. Thanks for
Thank
sharing.
you, Irene. That's awesome. I hope to be in touch with you soon.
Okay. Another question here. Are you aware of any resources to help queer or trans folk find rural communities that are relatively safe and friendly for us? Myself and many friends are hoping eventually to leave city life, and this is one piece of the land search that's hard to pin down if you don't already have connections in the area in question.
Yeah, I think that it is so regional and patchy right now. I'm in North Grenville, and there is like a kind of budding queer community here, but if I were to like pick an area, I would say that Lanark County is actually like really, really awesome. Queer Connection Lanark is quite a thriving queer group. A lot of folks are rural and doing farming. I think that land is still like relatively affordable compared to other areas. If I were to pick a spot to move, it would be there. And then I also think that the Greater Toronto area, just because of its proximity to the city, seems to have a lot of really interesting stuff going on, both in terms of the queer community and not. There was a conference organized called Not Your Farmer's Farm Conference. I believe you could find them on Instagram. And they are like prioritizing queer farmers and like farmers of color. And they have like a series of kind of farms and folks who are like doing a lot of interesting stuff if you want to check that out. There's also Ontario like queer youth or Ontario rural queer youth on Instagram that have a lot of resources as well.
Awesome. They say, amazing. I appreciate the insight. All right. Are there any more questions? Doesn't seem to be. All right. Well, I think that's probably it. Doesn't seem to be any more questions popping up in the chat. So I just want to say again that this video, if you'd like to share it with people, it will be going on the museum's YouTube page. So if you keep in touch, we can get that to you if you need later. And yeah, thank you again so much, Rachel. It's been really nice to get to know you over this process. And thank you again for all the time and effort you put into your presentation. It's been wonderful.
Thank you, everyone. It's been really lovely.